And joining us now here in studio are Cheran. He is professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Criminology at the University of Windsor. And we're happy to see you at TVO again.
Thank you.
You've been here a few times now. Well, let's just do a little background before we start. Sri Lanka had this awful civil war, 25 years long, 70,000 people killed. Remind us, what eventually brought this war to an end?
One of the reasons for the end of the war is the final push by the government of Sri Lanka and its security forces, aided and abetted by the international community, primarily India, China, Russia, UK, and the US. That was the main reason why the war ended in May 2009. And the second reason was the all kinds of miscalculations and some kind of fundamental errors committed by the liberation tigers of the Tamilam or the Tamil tigers, coupled with the changing international scenario and the global positions of global hegemony. So there was a confluence of factors that contributed to the end of the war in May 2009.
Now, in May 2010, the Sri Lankan Prime Minister, or President rather, appointed what he called the Lessons Learnt and Reconciliation Commission in the aftermath of the war. What was the commission set out to do?
Actually, the name, the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, is a misnomer. The mandate of the commission was to inquire into the failure of the 2002 ceasefire accord that came into existence between the government of Sri Lanka and the liberation tigers of Tamilam. The commission was not mandated to do some work on accountability or the war crime atrocities or war crimes. So that was completely a different issue.
So you are, I was going to read out some of the recommendations here, but just before I do that, you were not impressed with basically what this commission, what its marching orders were.
Yeah, it's very simple to say that if you permit me to quote from the Louis Arbour, former Canadian Supreme Court Justice and the current president of International Crisis Group, who said this commission was fundamentally flawed because this commission is not about accountability, and commission was not mandated to address the issues of war crimes or all kinds of other atrocities committed in the last stage of the war. So in that sense, it was fundamentally flawed.
All right, having said that, I'm going to read out a few recommendations here, and then I want to get your opinion on those. For example, the articulation of grievances by the Tamil people continues to remain at the center of the Sinhala-Tamil relationship and need to be recognized and addressed directly and fairly as the first step in the post-conflict process of reconciliation and peaceful coexistence. The Commission heard from many Tamil persons and noted the sense of marginalization expressed by them due to the language policy and the deficiencies in its implementation followed by successive governments. The official bodies for executing the language policies and monitoring performance should have adequate representation of the Tamil-speaking people and Tamil-speaking regions. The learning of each other's languages should be made a compulsory part of the school curriculum. This would be a primary tool to ensure attitudinal changes amongst the two communities. Teaching Tamil to Sinhala children and Sinhala to Tamil children will result in greater understanding of each other's cultures. Okay, what's your reaction to that?
Well, these are very sensible ideas which have been suggested in the context of Sri Lanka for the past 35 or 40 years. There is nothing to in terms of these kind of recommendations. I really welcome that kind of, it's very sensible in terms of suggesting certain kinds of political resolution and in terms of addressing the militarization of the Tamil areas and also in terms of dealing with the land issues. But the point here is that it's the whole issue in the Sri Lankan context right now is not the addressing all these issues. It is necessary, it's a long-term process, but the fundamental issue in terms of reconciliation is to acknowledge what happened in May 2009 and also to bring the idea of accountability in terms of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So we all know that without any kind of acknowledgement and accountability, we cannot simply move forward.
So you, as a Tamil, feel that has not yet been done?
Well, there is, if you look at the ground situation, there is no movement towards the whole idea of reconciliation. In order for the idea and the practice of reconciliation to move forward, we need to have acknowledgement on the part of the government of Sri Lanka and part of both communities. And second, and the idea of accountability. We all know that if we look at the UN expert panel report on what happened in May 2009, I'm also kind of a little bit puzzled by why the international media and the government of the US government and the UK and all kinds of the so-called major players of the international community simply talking about the Lessons Learned Commission, but not talking about the UN panel report on the last stages of the war.
Well, let me do a follow-up on that. The United Nations Human Rights Commission urged the Sri Lankan government to implement the recommendations and start a credible investigation into allegations of human rights abuses. Has this happened?
No, but the point is that the UN has appointed a special panel report, and the UN has come out with an expert report on what happened, and no one is talking about it. So it is like talking about the government appointed by the Sri Lankan government, and the members of the commission were government officers and former attorney general. And then we have a history in Sri Lanka that the habit of appointing commissions and simply forgetting about it. It has been very well recorded by Amnesty International, International Crisis Group, and in UN itself. So there is a pattern to this kind, establishing how we're having this kind of commission, but simply forgetting about it. In that sense, I am not only puzzled, but I'm also appalled at the selectivity and hypocrisy of the so-called international community in granting certain kinds of leeway to the government of Sri Lanka.
If the international community, whatever that means,
the
big powers that you just talked about, if they were to put more pressure on the Sri Lankan government, do you think that would have an impact?
I think it will definitely have an impact if they have the will to do that.
I want to ask you a bit more about you and people like you, people in the diaspora. What role do you see Tamils and Sinhalese living outside of Sri Lanka, in countries around the world like Canada? What role do you have in pursuing reconciliation, making it happen?
We need to understand that the process of reconciliation is not an overnight thing. It takes enormous amounts of time, passion, compassion, energy, and patience. And second, we also need to understand or to expect there must be certain kind of ground reality in Sri Lanka where we can identify and say, well, the conditions are there for a positive and genuine kind of reconciliation. In my opinion, that is not there. And thirdly, if we want to talk about the people that live outside Sri Lanka, like the so-called diaspora communities, I refused, or I'm a bit reluctant to use the term diaspora communities here. I would rather use the term transnational communities.
You'd rather use the term?
Transnational communities.
Transnational communities,
Yeah.
okay.
So,
what's the difference?
The difference is that, if we want to talk about diaspora communities, that people who are forced out of the country because of civil war, ethnic cleansing, or genocide, it's a result of part and parcel of a large-scale forced migration. The transnational community, you mean people who leave their countries for various kinds of reasons, for employment. For example, Canadians but living in Florida, you don't call them diaspora, you can call them transnational community, right? So
I don't call them either. I call them people who want warmer weather in the wintertime.
But in the areas of research, there are people who are doing U.S. military diaspora in Iraq. There are people using the term diaspora.
Okay.
But the point here is that diaspora or transnational community, they're not monolithic. There are all kinds of different perspectives, different ideologies, and different kinds of practices and commitment. So I would like to caution that there's two kinds of major development taking place in transnational communities. One is what I call, the politics of responsibility. The other one is called the politics of irresponsibility. Mm-hmm. So irresponsibility of distance and the responsibility of distance. So we clearly see these kind of things happening in the communities of Tamil and Sinhalese and Muslim communities that live outside Sri Lanka. So the communities, the transnational communities that practice the responsibility of distance, they understand they cannot simply represent Tamils in Sri Lanka. They can only speak next to them in solidarity.
Okay, but let me get to the bigger question here, which is, do you think reconciliation is possible?
Right now, it is impossible because, as I mentioned before, there is no acknowledgement, there is no accountability. Then the reconciliation is impossible. And there is also a deep divide between these two communities. The one community is celebrating victory over Tamils in May 2009, and the Tamils are mourning their dead.
But South Africa went through this, right? And they set up the commission, and from most accounts I've read, it's been quite successful. Why hasn't that happened here?
You mean reconciliation?
Yes.
In order for reconciliation to happen, there are three fundamental ingredients need to be there. First, the regime or the state that was responsible for committing all these kind of crimes should not be there. Second, the society and the state or whoever involved, they need to acknowledge that something has happened. And third, they should be willing to engage in genuine reconciliation. If all these three elements are there, then we can start talking about or discussing about genuine reconciliation. In the context of Sri Lanka, these elements or these constituents are not there.
Okay, I'm going to play some tape here, okay? Check the monitor out over my shoulder here. We're going to play a clip from a program we hosted a little while ago called Moving Sri Lanka Forward. We had 4 young Canadians on the program, 2 Tamil, 2 Sinhalese, talking about how they engage with their respective communities here in Canada. And here is what one Sinhalese Canadian had to say about engaging with the Tamil community. Roll tape, please.
Why it's so important for me to engage across the lines of ethnicity, for me to understand the plight of the Tamil community and try to share with them sort of the plight my parents experienced as well, economically, socially, and politically in that country, that might be deeply connected to sort of the Tamil struggle as well. Because I believe that in order to move forward to create inclusive Sri Lanka, we need to overcome the fact that these issues are just something that only affects the Tamil community. It affects women in that country. And it affects, lower, women, people of lower, social class in that country. So I think it would be great if, the way that we've been addressing the issues in Sri Lanka, if it could transcend just the issue of ethnicity and go further.
Is that possible?
Well, I think I very much welcome all kinds of initiatives in terms of addressing the issue of dialogue and solidarity and reconciliation. So every single attempt or the work, it really counts. But the difficulty is that as long as we have this great divide between communities, all these attempts will not really create any kind of deep impact in bringing communities together.
But I think part of her point is, if you only see this as a Tamil Sinhalese issue, A, that's too simplistic, and B, you're not going to get closer to the finish line that way. You've got to see it in all of its beautiful complexity.
Well, there are lots of other examples. For if I may, I would take her comments and the comments that emanate from people who are engaged in that kind of work as in the spirit of solidarity. We really welcome the spirit of solidarity, but spirit of solidarity from various groups should come first in order to acknowledge what their own communities, whether it be in Tamil or Sinhalese, what their own communities and their state done to the others. That is one of the fundamental ingredients in order to come to terms with what we see. We could go on. There's a small group of Sinhalese journalists, writers, and activists and poets who articulate the viewpoint that first the Sinhalese people should own up to the grave atrocities committed by the government of Sri Lanka, and then the collective Sinhalese psyche in celebrating and organizing victory celebrations every year in May. So there's some kind of a collective psyche that operates between Tamils and the Sinhalese when it comes to these kind of issues. That needs to be transcended. But in order for all of us to transcend that particular kind of thing, as I said before, a degree of acknowledgement, a degree of accountability is a must.
Professor, how long are you prepared to wait for that acknowledgement?
Well, as I said, it depends on various factors. Chief factor is the will of the international community, and the second is the effect and the willingness of the communities and leaders of the communities to come forward. And third, the willingness of the ability of the Sri Lankan state to reform itself.
Because you know that Armenians are waiting 100 years for Turks to acknowledge what happened, a genocide of 100 years ago.
Well, that's true. You know, not only they are waiting for 100 more years. We might have to wait even more years. But you know, if we look at the history of genocide, history of ethnic cleansing, you know, the acknowledgement sometimes take a long time. But that doesn't mean that we should not simply shy away from demanding acknowledgement and accountability. It is not a question of Tamils and Sinhalese, but in the case of the Tamils, what happened in May 2009 is an issue for entire human civilization. If we do not really address that issue, the entire human civilization is going to be in trouble. Because I don't want to say, you know, as Louis Arbour would say, we should not simply grant the Sri Lanka option for all the other countries like Syria and Burma to follow it up.
Professor Cheran, we always appreciate your visits here at TVO. Thanks a lot for coming in tonight.
Thank you for having me here.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.